Hello, so this week we're looking at chapters 9 and 10. So chapter 9 is the last one that deals with one of the Olympian gods, and this is the chapter focused on Dionysus. So Dionysus is the god of wine. He's also the god of drama. Now, as Nathan Lane says in a production of The Frogs, if you get a little wine, then you get a lot of drama. So, but because he's connected with grapes and vines and vineyards, and one consumes that stuff, and then when you're in a somewhat alcoholic state, you adopt sort of a different personality from your normal day-to-day personality. So you can see where the idea of drama, where you've got actors taking on the roles of characters, would definitely fit in with that. The big thing about Dionysus that I want us to emphasize is that Dionysus is a god marked by presence. Now, most Greek gods are marked by absence. Apollo would be the best example of this because he's even known as Apollo who shoots from afar. Right? That's the most common epithet used of him. So he's a god who is distant. When you go to the Oracle of Delphi, you don't deal with him directly. You deal with a priest who interprets a priestess's ramblings, which are supposedly inspired by Dionysus. So you're not actually dealing directly with the god, but dealing through intermediaries. And the other Olympian gods tend to be that way as well. Hermes is known for sort of hanging around with humans, but he's also, you don't sort of deal with him directly. But Dionysus, because he is actually considered in the wine, in the grape, when you consume him, you're taking the god into your body. So, which is part of the reason why in Christianity you've got the idea of the drinking of the wine. This wine, it's the cup of my blood, the blood of a new generation, that sort of thing. That whole sentiment expressed in the Gospels definitely would, to an ancient audience, awaken the idea of Dionysus and the idea of consuming the god. Dionysiac ritual tends to be disruptive, right? So just like Mardi Gras or anything like that, which we would have, which would be a similar type thing, this is not the normal day-to-day thing, right? If you go to Mardi Gras, you basically go there to get drunk and party, right? Which you don't do on your, every day. I mean, if you do it every day, you're heading for an early grave. But it's, you sort of blow off steam. The idea of Mardi Gras in origin, it's the last day before Lent. So it's the last day when you can party before the time of Lent when you're supposed to give stuff up. But so it's a disruptive ritual thing. The passage that you've got is Euripides' Bacchae, which is one of Euripides' last plays. It tells the story of Dionysus coming back to Thebes, which is the city that he was from. His mother was a princess in Thebes, and he's returning to Thebes to initiate worship of himself there. He encounters resistance by the king of Thebes, a guy named Pentheus, and what he does is Dionysus eventually sort of seduces Pentheus, and Pentheus goes out to witness what he thinks are orgies in the hills, and instead the women who were out there, they see him, they first think he's a spy, which he is, then they think that he is some wild animal, and they tear him apart. Now this tearing apart is actually a reference to actual Dionysiac practice where, at least in olden times, I don't know that they did this in the classical period, but they would call on Dionysus. There'd be a goat. Of course, this is wild. There's wild music. There's wild dancing. There's a lot of craziness going on. That would affect the goat. The goat would then start to act up. They would say, look, the god is here. Then they would set upon the goat. They would tear the goat to pieces, and then they would consume part of the goat as a way, as sort of a a rather, to us, brutal and barbaric form of communion. That, by the way, is called sparagmos, the tearing apart of a victim, and homophagy, the eating of the sort of the divine, presence is supposed to be in that animal. At any rate, that is what happens in effect to Pentheus. Pentheus gets killed and torn apart, which is how the play sort of ends. So it's a pretty rough play, and some people even read it as an attack on religion, which is, given Euripides' track record, is not a crazy idea. It's just that he did win the first prize, and he didn't win the first prize often, but he won the first prize for this play and some other plays. And it seems highly unlikely that he won the first prize if he was attacking the god in charge of the festival where the plays were being performed in the theater of Dionysus itself. It seems unlikely. But it does present a rather dark view of Dionysus. There's also a short poem, Homeric Hymn number 7. It's about 50 lines. It tells the story of how Dionysus was kidnapped by pirates. Of course, he was dressed in purple, right? He's Dionysus, so he's dressed in purple, and they think he's a prince. Ancient pirates, made their money by, attacking, kidnapping rich people and holding them for ransom. That's sort of how they made most of their money. So this is within what, the pirates' wheelhouse. They kidnap him. Of course, it turns out that he's not actually human, and only the helmsman realizes this. And the captain, it turns out badly for the captain and for the crew, but the helmsman is saved because the helmsman recognized that Dionysus was a god, didn't know he was Dionysus, but recognized he was a god and deserved respect. So, the scholarship for Chapter 9 looks at ritual just like the previous chapter, Chapter 8 did, but unlike the ritual there, right, they use Van Gennep's scheme of separation, then the trial or ordeal, and then reintegration in the community. That fits the bottom thing here, a ritual of elevation. You're changing your status. Examples for us would be you're entering the army, you're getting married, right? Once you've sort of undergone that, you can't sort of go back from it. I mean, you can get divorced, but, once you're married, then you're married. You're no longer someone who is single and unmarried. You can be married or divorced, but the point is you've been married, right? So you enter a new stage of life. Graduation from college would be another sort of, type ritual like that. Dionysiac ritual is actually focused on in a version of the norm. So you're not doing what you normally do, right? This is wild, you're partying, you're doing all that other stuff. And then as a result, this is a temporary thing, right? For the time of the festival, the rules of society are suspended. But of course, they will go back to a return to the norm, right, soon after. The comparison section is actually a Roman poem by Catullus. Catullus, poem number 63. Catullus' poems don't really have titles. They have numbers, and 63 is a poem about Attis. Now, it focuses on the Eastern goddess Cybele. So Cybele is a goddess from the East, from like Syria or someplace like that, somewhere in Asia. And her worship was wild. There'd be drumming, there'd be wild music, there'd be dancing, and the followers of Cybele, the priests at any rate of Cybele, were castrati. They were castrated as part of like their initiation, and this looks at Cybele's partner, who is a mortal named Attis, and the poem. The poem is sort of remarkable, especially the opening of the poem. Within the first 10 lines, Attis arrives in the East from Greece. He goes into the ritual. It's all wild and crazy. He castrates himself. Then he passes out. And then the poem slows down. And the next day he wakes up and immediately feels regret because he's castrated himself. Of course, there's no way of undoing that. There's no reset button once you've done that. And he remembers how he had been this great athlete, and everyone sort of loved him, and now look at him, he's different. So part of this, I think, is the Roman skepticism regarding this Eastern stuff. The Romans were not big on wild religion, and I think they viewed the worship of Cybele, though necessary. There was a temple of Cybele in Rome. Roman citizens could not be priests of Cybele because they had to be castrated. And so there seems to be this Roman skepticism, like, yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the moment, but then there are consequences the next day when you wake up. So the background stuff, the Nachleben stuff for this chapter for Dionysus looks at Dionysus in 1969. So in 1969 there was a play called Dionysus in 69, which was a version of the Bacchae. It was done in a theater where there was no stage. People were seated around a central open area, which was sort of the stage. But the point is that the audience could go down into that open area and cast members could go out into the audience. If you look it up on YouTube, you can actually see a film version of this by Brian De Palma, who later went on to make Carrie and some other stuff. This is an early film of his. It's sort of tough to watch. I mean, it's tough to know what's going on. It's very dark. It was done at an actual performance of it, and so it's tough, but it is available. Is my main thing. The second thing I've got listed here is a work by a man named Harry Parch, and this was done earlier, I think, called Revelation in Courthouse Park. Basically, what this does is it takes the Bacchae story and it mixes it with like a figure like Elvis. In this case, his name is Dion. Comes to this small town in rural America, and there's going to be a concert at Courthouse Park. And so this is like a modern take. And the play actually sort of interchanges. It's an opera, actually. It interchanges between the Euripides play and this modern version. So Parch is basically looking at like the Elvis phenomena or Beatlemania as very much like the Dionysus experience. And then Rocky Horror Picture Show would be another example. If you've know anything about Rocky Horror Picture Show, the movie itself is sort of interesting to see, and you can find it on DVD or streaming without any trouble. I mean, it'd be easy enough to find. But just watching it is not the full experience. The full experience is going to a theater. You're dressed up. You're dressed as one of the characters in the play, and you actually sort of the thing because you've seen it so many times that you shout lines back to the screen and so forth. So it's very interactive. But that story is all about this mad scientist, Dr. Frankenfurter, who sexually awakens this rather repressed couple, Brad and Janet, and sort of awakens their sexual desires. So it is very much a Dionysiac thing. Okay, so we're going to move on to Chapter 10. Chapter 10 deals with Greek heroes. And I have to say that the reason that I like mythology is primarily about the heroes. I'm much more interested in heroes, in stories about the heroes, than the gods. The Greek heroes were worshipped at shrines. So there was a shrine to Oedipus, there was a shrine to Heracles, there were several shrines to Heracles, there was a shrine to Achilles apparently, there was a shrine to Theseus. So the thing about this is, so heroes are figures of the past. They're heroes who did something great, and then they get a shrine to them, and they're worshipped at like annual festivals. And part of the reason they're worshipped is because they did great things, but part of it is also to placate their spirits. So the idea is these are great figures who did great things and therefore are greater than normal humans, and as a result could come back and cause a whole lot of trouble. And so you want to placate them, you want to keep them calm or happy. Heroes, ancient heroes, well, Greek heroes, I should say, do amazing things, but they're not always good things. So you could have a hero who actually is very destructive. In fact, the main hero in this chapter, Achilles, is actually known more for the destruction caused than for his otherwise being a great hero. And the figure of Cleometis, who is a historical figure, is worth noting because he was a hero as well. Cleometis was an Olympic athlete. He was expected to win one of the fighting contests. Seems like it's probably the Pancration, which was a no-holds-barred fight. The only thing, there were certain things you couldn't do, but there were only a few things. One of them is you couldn't gouge someone's eye out, and there were a couple of other things. Well, apparently, Cleometis actually did one of these forbidden things, and I think his opponent died, and Cleometis was not declared a winner. There was declared no winner, and he was sent home in shame, right, because he broke the rules. On his way home, he passed through a town. In the town, there were children who were singing. They were like at school, and they were singing some song, and it was happy. He, of course, not in the mood for happy, and so he gets angry, and he basically knocks down the support column that keeps the roof over the building. The roof collapses, the kids die. So basically, he kills a bunch of kids. The townspeople chase him. He runs into a temple. You couldn't take someone from a temple. There's sanctuary, and so they do not go in and arrest him or grab him in the temple. But they decide to basically cordon off the temple so that no one can get in, no one can bring him food, and so he will presumably starve to death. And after like some weeks or something like that, there's no indication of anyone in there anymore in the temple, and they sort of wonder, like, maybe he's probably dead. So then they go in. Now, they couldn't lay hands on him if he were still there, but he's disappeared. They go to Delphi. They ask the oracle what happened to Cleometis, and they say Cleometis has been sort of, has gone away. You now need to build a shrine to him. Okay, so Cleometis, his heroic act, his greater than normal human act, was basically killing a bunch of kids. That would not be something we would consider heroic. But ancient heroes are not necessarily good people. They are capable of doing great things, but they can be great things that are really bad. Right? So there's no guarantee they do things for the community. The literature from the beginning of chapter 1 is from probably if I had to say what's my overall favorite Greek work, it would be the Iliad. And Achilles is the hero of the Iliad. The Iliad tells of about 2 months in the last year of the Trojan War. So it doesn't tell the whole story of the Trojan War. Troy is not destroyed at the end of the poem, and Achilles is still alive at the end of the poem. But there, basically Troy's on its last leg. So is Achilles at the end of the poem. Achilles is known for his rage, right? So the opening word of the poem in Greek is menon, which is a form of Manus. Manus means like divine wrath. This is not human level anger. This is like, a wrath of the gods type stuff. Why is he angry? He's angry because he's been insulted by Agamemnon. So Agamemnon is the technical leader of the Greeks, but Achilles is the greatest of the Achaeans. He's their best warrior. And because he's their best warrior, he figures he deserves some respect. And so one thing he cannot allow happen is to be insulted by a lesser man, whom Agamemnon is. Agamemnon is a good warrior. He is not a great warrior. He's definitely not at the level of Achilles. And so if he accepts that from Agamemnon, then he's basically saying he is lesser than Agamemnon. So he resigns from the war, and bad things start happening for the Greeks. And they get really, really bad. Then he lets his friend Patroclus go into the war in his place. And that does give the Greeks some respite, but Patroclus gets killed. And that then further enrages Achilles. And he basically tries to kill as many Trojans as he can, with a view to getting Hector, the guy who actually killed Patroclus. He kills Hector, tries to really ravage the body after he kills Hector, but the gods sort of protect the body from any harm. And then in book 24, the last book of the last chapter of the work, he gives up Hector's body to Priam, the king of Troy, for burial. And in that, he's very gracious towards Priam. And Achilles in book 24 is returning to the way he had been before the poem starts, which is he was a fairly generous hero. He was not generally a hero marked by great anger and so forth. But in this poem, he definitely shows this anger. And what we see is the destructive power of the hero, even towards his own people. The scholarship of chapter 10 involves a guy named Vladimir Prop, a Russian a Soviet folklorist who most famous work is a short work. It's about 150 pages called Morphology of the Folktale. And what Prop did was he looked at 100 stories, 100 folk tales, and all of these are Russian quest stories. So a quest story is where the hero goes in search of something, right? He's sent on a mission to get something, or he himself decides to go in search of something. The story of Perseus going after the head of Medusa, right? He has to kill Medusa and chop off her head. That is a quest story. What Prop in the selection from Prop basically says that every Russian folk story, or at least based on these 100, follows the same basic pattern. In other words, they're all variations on the same story. And if you think of this, if you think of Star Trek episodes, they all follow the same, structurally they follow pretty much the same pattern. There's not much difference in the individual stories have individual quirks, but they all have the same pattern. The thing that to really get is what Maurizio says. The Prop part is actually sort of tough to read, and he says little more than these Russian folk tales all follow the same basic pattern, and that the functions are always in the same order. So what Prop discovered from looking at these 100 stories were there's 7 character types. So the hero is one of them, the villain is another. Donor is also a character type. This is someone who gives the hero some weapon or something special, which helps the hero. The dispatcher is the person who sends the hero on the mission. And that there were 31 functions, and by functions he means narrative elements. So this would be things like someone in the hero's family goes off, and something happens to them. The hero reacts. The hero goes off in search of their relative. The hero does this. So they're in certain, they come in certain, and they're always going to be in the same order, which makes sense, right? Before the hero can go after their relative, the relative has to go and something has to happen to them, right? You can't have him save the relative before the relative gets into trouble. So some of it makes pretty obvious sense. Now, there are 31 functions, according to him, and only 31 functions, but any folktale does not have all 31. Some might only have 3 or 4. I mean, they might only have just a few, but the point is they're going to be in that order. Prop is maybe not the best thing to have in chapter 10 because Achilles really doesn't follow this. Achilles is not really a quest hero. Odysseus in chapter 12 is really a quest hero because he goes, his quest is to get home. The comparison section looks at 2 works: the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a Mesopotamian work that tells the story of King Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh is a lot like Achilles. He's very self-centered. When we first meet him, he's actually doing terrible things to his people. He's not a good king. He's not a king who's taking care of his people. He's a king who's basically abusing his authority. But he meets a guy named Enkidu, and Enkidu and he then become best friends, and then they go off in a series of adventures where Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill monsters, which makes the city safer. So he becomes sort of a hero who helps his city. But initially he's not. So he's a lot more like a Greek hero, much more self-focused. Virgil's Aeneid, which was written in the 1st century BCE, Virgil died in 19 BCE. So in the work we have, clearly he wanted to do at least one or two more revisions, but we have basically the poem with a couple of rough spots. 19 BC is basically the publication date. It tells the story of Aeneas, who is, you remember Aeneas from chapter 5. He is the son of Aphrodite and Anchises. He will lead the survivors of Troy away, and they will eventually found a settlement in Italy. That settlement will eventually lead to the founding of Rome. Now, Rome's founded, 753 BCE is the traditional date. Troy falls around 1180 BCE. So we've got a 400-year gap here. So he can't found Rome, but what he can do is set up the mechanism which will then lead to Rome. And Virgil's story for Aeneas is that Aeneas learns to become a Roman hero. And a Roman hero does what he's supposed to for Rome. The only thing important in a Roman story is Rome. Rome is all about destiny. If you help Rome's destiny, you are a hero. If you do not help Rome's destiny, you can still be heroic, but you're doomed to failure. So, and so we have a hero here who's much more in control of himself, and he has to swallow a lot of stuff for the good of the community. So again, this is a different type of hero from certainly from Achilles. The passages from the Aeneid come from chapter 11 or book 11 and book 12, and we get the very end of the Aeneid in here, the selection. And the ending of the Aeneid is, I think, one of the most amazing things from ancient literature. Aeneas has, for the most part, been able to keep his emotions in check to do what he has to do to help this project. I mean, he doesn't know about Rome exactly because it's too far in the future, but he knows he's on this sort of mission from the gods, and he sort of follows that. But in the very last act of the very last moment of the work, what he does is he gives into rage, which is not a good thing. Strong emotion is not a good thing for the Romans. Strong emotion is going to lead to trouble. And he gives into strong emotion. He kills Turnus, and Turnus' ghost goes screaming to the underworld. That's the end of the poem. There's no resolution. There's nothing like the end of the Iliad, where we have a resolution. Achilles, who had been consumed by rage, comes back to being a person somewhat in control and somewhat generous. And he treats Priam with respect and with a certain amount of generosity. And we get the funeral of Hector, which ends the Iliad. So there's a nice sort of denouement to the story, right? It doesn't end at a climactic point. The Aeneid actually ends with the death of Turnus. That's the very last thing. The very last line of the poem has the ghost going screaming to the underworld. Well, where's the resolution? Where do you have things, right? Because the whole point is things are supposed to come back to normal, but it ends on this moment of rage. So what are we to make of that? It's like, I don't know. I mean, it's a sort of troubling and really shocking end. I mean, the two things that I can compare to it, the ending of Sopranos, where they go to the shop and then suddenly there's a cut to black, and it's like, what happened? Did Tony and his family get killed? I mean, we don't know what happened, right? Because we're not shown that. It just ends, and we're left with wondering what's going on. The other would be the ending of Twin Peaks in its original run, where Agent Cooper, who's been a good guy for the entire time, the very last scene, he's in the restroom, he's gone into the restroom, and when he looks up in the mirror, he sees Bob, which means now Agent Cooper is now possessed by this figure of Bob, this evil figure. And again, it's a strange way to end, because you've had this good guy who suddenly now has been possessed, in effect, by a satanic figure. And it's like, holy crap. I mean, what a way to end. And that's the way I think the ending of the Aeneid is. It's very much a shock. Finally, the Nachleben section deals with three poems that look at Achilles. One is a World War I poem, one is a World War II poem, and one is by a guy from Northern Ireland that deals with the Troubles, right? So the battles between the Catholics and the Protestants in Northern Ireland. the But they all look at it differently. So like the World War II guy, his big thing is when Achilles fought, he fought face to face, right? His enemies saw him, he saw the enemy, right? There's a personal touch to war then. But in World War II, the author of this particular poem was himself a bomber in World War II. Well, bombers don't get to see who they bomb, right? They see buildings and they bomb buildings, and hundreds of people are certainly in those buildings, but you don't see them. You don't know their pain. You don't see any of that because you're too far away. And so that for him is sort of a troubling thing, that there's something more honorable, at least, if you have to face the person you're going to kill face to face. And there's a word that's mentioned. We don't really get much from it in Maurizio, but this is a Dr. Jonathan Shea, who wrote a book called Achilles in Vietnam. Shea is a psychiatrist who works at Mass General Hospital in Boston, and he's also a professor of psychiatry at Harvard. And he worked with a classics professor named Gregory Nagy at Harvard, who's a scholar of Homer. And what Shea started doing was with these focus groups of Vietnam vets, right? So they would come for therapy and they would do group therapy sessions. He had them read the Iliad, and they would talk about the Iliad as a way to process their feelings about Vietnam. And it's quite a nice little book. And of course, Shea makes some observations about things in the Vietnam War that made it especially disorienting for the vets returning, because of the experience that previous warriors didn't have because of the way things were set up. So I recommend the book wholeheartedly. If you get some time, look at it. I would say read the Iliad first if you haven't read it. And if you read the Iliad, my recommendation would be read Robert Fagel's translation. I just think it's of the translations that are out there, I think it's the best. It's powerful, and it's also pretty accurate. The most accurate one, I think, comes across as being sort of dull, which is unfortunate. Like Powell's, I think is fairly accurate, but I find Powell's translation to be a sort of dull, and some other ones that are more accurate tend to be a little bit dull. But Fagel's, I think, has some of that oomph that I think you need, even if it's a little bit loose. So I would recommend that if you're going to read a translation. So that ends it for this time. This is a much longer thing than usual, but there are a lot of stuff to cover. So we've got one more lecture, and we're out.